Hi, I'm Dr. Craig Malkin, clinical psychologist and lecturer for Harvard Medical School. I'm also the author of Rethinking Narcissism, which is devoted to helping you understand and cope with all narcissism in all its forms and in all your relationships. I want to do a quick follow-up to the last video I did, which was about covert narcissism. First, a brief overview, covert versus overt. You want to think of covert narcissism as people who feel special, unique, exceptional compared to the rest of humanity. On the inside, they're not outward about it. They tend to feel exceptional or unique or special because of their pain or they're feeling misunderstood. Nobody understands the emotional problems they have, and they are mistreated. They often feel like victims, of course. So that, and then on the outside, um, that's where they show this apparent vulnerability. And I say apparent because true vulnerability, true emotional vulnerability is really about being very clear about what you're feeling and what you need and turning to people in vulnerable ways. And that is not either from experience working clinically when somebody is extremely narcissistic in this covert way or introverted way. That is not how they present their vulnerability. And you want to think of overt narcissism, or these are people who are obviously grandiose, chest thumping braggarts. They agree with statements like, I like looking at myself in the mirror, and everybody laughs at my jokes. Um, so they also tend to be more openly charismatic and energetic and like being in social groups, so hence extroverted. And that pattern is why I prefer to distinguish between these types as introverted and extroverted. The overt narcissists have their grandiosity on the outside and their insecurity, which is attachment insecurity, that is fears of what will happen when they get truly close to someone. That's all on the inside. Up until now, there hasn't been a whole lot of great research on the difference between these types, um, or even a reflection of that difference in the Bible of mental health, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That's changing, but there's also some really interesting research on the differences between how these two types present when they are abusive. And that's what I want to talk about today. Psychologist Dr. Ava Green at City University of London, did some fascinating research where she looked at both the covert and the overt types of narcissists. And importantly, she used a measure of pathology, which that often isn't done either. That is, she looked at people who scored high on the pathological narcissism inventory, which luckily, divides people into the more introverted or extroverted or vulnerable and overt kinds of narcissism, covert and overt. And what she did then was she also looked, after she gave people this measure, she also looked at measures of abuse. That is both physical abuse and emotional abuse. Physical abuse being things obviously like pushing, shoving, physical aggression, and emotional abuse being things like name calling, put down, gaslighting. That is treating someone as though there's something wrong with them or convincing them that there's something wrong with them, or the silent treatment. And what she found was fascinating. I want to talk about what she found in men. She looked at gender differences, and that's interesting in its own right. That is actually her area of specialty. It's too much to get into here. I might do a follow-up video on it. But since most survivors and people who are talking about their experiences, they are running into people who are diagnosed with NPD who are men, and that's in the research as well. It's that more grandiose type, the more obvious type that tends to come out in the research because, again, that's what's reflected and described in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I want to focus today on what the different types of abuse look like in men. So on the men who scored high on that more introverted or covert narcissism, they were the ones who were more likely to engage in obvious, overt physical sexual abuse, that is hitting, pushing, aggression. Um, and of the pathological narcissists who presented that more obvious, loud, bragging, boastful type, where the grandiosity is on the outside, they were more likely to engage in emotional abuse. Again, those things like name calling, put downs, employing the silent treatment, and actually is consistent with previous research. And I know it's contrary to what people have experienced in discussions on blogs and on even here on YouTube, where the idea is that somehow it's covert narcissism engages in those more subtle forms of abuse, but there's still some utility in distinguishing between the two, and I'm going to explain why. But so in the previous research, what we found is that people who score high on that more obvious or extroverted form of narcissism also tend to score high on Machiavellianism, which is a chess playing approach to life and relationships, intentional, planful, devious, psychopathy, which is you want to think of as guiltless, shameless, deceit, and manipulation. Notice these are all about manipulation. Sadism, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's taking pleasure in other people's pain. That together is called the dark tetrad. And what we know from the research is that people who score on the dark tetrad are more likely to engage in those very cold and calculating, thought through ways of causing harm, of deceiving, of manipulation. So in a way, it's not surprising that the men who scored high on that more obvious form also tended to were the ones who were more likely to engage in that kind of abuse, gaslighting, emotional abuse. The reason I think this is important is that I think this is again one of the traps, if you will, of the introverted or covert narcissism, being in a relationship with a man with that tendency, and that is they have that apparent vulnerability that I had called in my previous video emotionality. That means it's a display of emotion. It's not a clear feeling like sadness or fear. It is, for example, your partner collapsing and beating themselves up and saying nobody understands and acting in a way that scares you and pulls you in. In survivors, and in particular people who have a form of echoism, and if you remember, echoism is fear of being a burden or fear of seeming narcissistic in any way. Go back and watch my videos and read what I've written if you'd like to hear more about that. In the more caretaking quality of echoists, for them, again, that is a cue for caretaking. They see that and they want to come in and help because that's what they learned growing up. This is such a trap because if you hear what's happening here, understand that the very people who have that apparent, the partners who have that apparent vulnerability, the men who seem to show that display, are the ones who are then most likely to engage in extreme abuse, outward, obvious abuse. So in the beginning, this might seem like somebody who struggles and maybe even struggles in the way that you do, and they're not. That's sort of full of themselves and all the ways that we tend to often think about narcissism. And then they have these moments that you might get pulled in, that these are precisely the type who are likely to engage in the most obvious forms of abuse. And then it's the more charismatic blowhard who engages in the more planned out, insidious forms of abuse. So I think the way you want to hold on to that and make use of it is you need to know the difference between emotionality and emotion. Again, emotionality is not true emotional expression. It's a display of feeling for the sake of creating an effect, whether conscious or unconscious, and often it is unconscious, but it is not asking for anything in any clear way. It's not about vulnerability, and I want to make that again very clear that the problem with it is that it's apparent vulnerability. And if you see that, just know that it is also a clear predictor for later on very obvious forms of abuse. So I hope that's helpful for you in thinking about these differences. And like I said, I'll probably do a follow-up on the gender differences. And if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe, come back, leave comments. I often respond to comments. And I look forward to seeing you again at the next video. Thanks.